The call came at 9:17 in the evening. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the microwave clock when my phone lit up with Jacqueline's name, and the first thing I thought was that something must be wrong. My wife never called while driving. In 10 years of marriage, she had never once broken that rule, not even the night her father died. Not even when she got the promotion that changed her career. So, when I saw her name on that screen, my stomach dropped before I even answered. If you've ever had that feeling, the one where you know something terrible is about to happen, but you can't stop it, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Because this story is about to take you somewhere you won't expect. Hey, what's going on? I kept my voice casual, hoping I was overreacting. There was a pause on the other end, and then Jacqueline spoke in a tone I recognized from only once before years ago, when a man had followed us to our car in a parking garage, and she had calmly told me to get in and lock the doors while she handled it. I never found out exactly what she said to him, but he had walked away pale and shaking. That same voice came through the phone now. Ryan, I need you to come to Millers Creek Road, about 2 miles past the lake entrance. There are 2 men who have pulled me over, and they're claiming to be community security officers. I was already grabbing my keys. Are you okay? Did you call the police? Another pause. That's the thing, she said quietly. They want me to believe they are the police, but they're not. Their badges say Pinewood Heights Security Enforcement, no badge numbers, no department name. The uniforms look close, but the patches are wrong, and they're not running my plates through any system. They already knew my name before I rolled down the window. Millers Creek was 12 minutes from our house on a normal night. I made it in 7, running 2 stop signs and praying no actual police would pull me over. Jacqueline stayed on the line the entire time, her voice steady as she continued describing the scene. 2 men, both white, mid-40s, one stocky with a shaved head, the other taller with a military-style haircut. Their vehicle was a black SUV with a light bar mounted on top, but no unit number, no department insignia. They had asked her to step out for a routine compliance check, and when she asked what that meant, the stocky one had smiled and said, "Ma'am, this is HOA jurisdiction. We have authority here." I could hear the arrogance in his voice through the phone, the particular confidence of a man who believes he holds power over someone weaker. What he didn't know was that my wife had spent years dealing with men exactly like him, in situations far more dangerous than a dark road in a gated community. When I arrived, the scene looked exactly like a legitimate traffic stop at first glance. The SUV was parked at an angle behind Jacqueline's car, emergency lights painting the trees in alternating blue and red. The 2 men stood on either side of my wife, who was leaning against her driver's door with her arms crossed. She looked small between them, and every protective instinct I had screamed at me to intervene. But as I stepped out of my truck, Jacqueline caught my eye and gave me a look that said clearly, "I have this under control. Trust me." The stocky one turned toward me, his hand moving to rest on something at his belt. "Sir, this is a private matter between the Pinewood Heights Homeowners Association and one of our residents. I'm going to need you to return to your vehicle." I ignored him and walked closer, close enough now to confirm what Jacqueline had described on the phone. The badges were wrong. The patches were wrong. Everything about these men was a performance designed to intimidate, and they had chosen my wife as their target. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and neither is she. Not until you explain exactly what authority you think you have to detain a citizen on a public road." The taller one stepped forward, his jaw tight. "This road passes through HOA managed territory, under community bylaws. We have the right to conduct safety and compliance checks on all residents. Your wife failed to stop at the checkpoint last Tuesday. This is a follow-up. There was no checkpoint last Tuesday. Jacqueline and I had both driven that road a dozen times in the past week, and there had never been anything resembling a checkpoint. These men were lying, and they weren't even good at it. But what disturbed me more than their lies was their confidence, the absolute certainty that suggested they had done this before and gotten away with it every time. I looked at Jacqueline, expecting to see frustration or at least cold anger. Instead, I saw her studying them not the way a victim studies her attackers, but the way a professional assesses a problem she has already solved in her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made both men shift uncomfortably. "I know who you report to," she said. I know this isn't the first time you've done this, and I know exactly how this operation works, because I've seen it before 3 times, in 3 different states, run by people who thought they were untouchable. The stocky one's smile faltered. The taller one's hand twitched toward his belt. Jacqueline didn't flinch. So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to let us leave. And then you're going to go back to whoever sent you and tell them that you picked the wrong target. She paused. And in the red-blue flash of their fake emergency lights, I saw something in her eyes that I had never fully understood in 10 years of marriage, a depth of experience she had never explained, a capability I had only glimpsed in fragments. Because I'm not just going to report this, I'm going to end it. The 2 men exchanged a look. For the first time since I arrived, they seemed uncertain, and in that moment, watching my wife face down 2 men twice her size with nothing but her voice and her presence, I realized I had married someone far more dangerous than I ever knew. We made it home that night without further incident. The 2 men had let us go after Jacqueline's warning, though not before the stocky one muttered something about following up through proper channels. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those fake emergency lights flashing in the darkness, those costumes designed to make ordinary people feel powerless. Jacqueline, on the other hand, was already working. When I came downstairs at 2 in the morning, I found her at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts, HOA bylaws, state regulations, what looked like corporate registration documents. She didn't look up when I entered. She just said, "Go back to bed. Ryan, I need to understand how deep this goes." I stood there for a moment, watching her highlight passages with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work before. Then I went back upstairs, knowing that whatever was happening, my wife had shifted into a mode I didn't fully understand. The first violation notice arrived before noon the next day. I found it taped to our front door, a formal-looking document on Pinewood Heights HOA letterhead, citing Jacqueline for failure to comply with mandatory security verification and threatening behavior toward community enforcement personnel. The language was bureaucratic, almost comically official, but the threat underneath was clear. A fine of $500 had been assessed. A compliance hearing had been scheduled for the following week. And at the bottom, in bold red text, failure to appear will result in escalated enforcement actions, up to and including property liens and community expulsion. I stood on our porch reading it 3 times, each time feeling my anger rise higher. These people had ambushed my wife on a dark road, and now they were accusing her of being the aggressor. Jacqueline photographed every page, including the envelope and postmark. "The details matter," she said simply. "Organizations like this always leave trails. They just don't expect anyone to follow them." The surveillance started 2 days later. A black SUV, the same model from that night, began appearing on our street at irregular intervals. Sometimes it was parked 3 houses down, sometimes it crawled past at 5 miles per hour, the driver's face obscured by tinted windows. Our neighbors noticed, and their reactions told me everything I needed to know about the HOA's reputation in Pinewood Heights. Mrs. Patterson from across the street warned us in a hushed voice that people who fight the board tend to have problems, mentioning a family named Chen who had disputed a fence violation 2 years ago and ended up selling their house within 6 months. The Thomases next door stopped waving when we drove past, and I overheard Mr. Thomas telling his wife that he didn't want to get involved in whatever the Howards did. This wasn't just social awkwardness, it was learned behavior. The community had been trained to abandon anyone who drew the board's attention. Within a week, we had become pariahs, and we hadn't even attended the hearing yet. Jacqueline documented everything: license plates, timestamps, photographs of the SUV from our bedroom window. She created folders on her laptop with clinical precision, cross-referencing surveillance patterns with the HOA's organizational structure. When I asked her why she was treating this like a criminal investigation, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Because I've seen how these operations work from the inside. The structure is always the same: legitimate organization on paper, enforcement arm that operates outside the law, revenue stream that depends on keeping residents afraid. This is an amateur hour. Ryan, someone built this system deliberately." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, but the way she said "from the inside" lodged in my mind like a splinter. The hearing took place in the HOA Community Center. The room was arranged like a courtroom, with a long table at the front where 3 board members sat in judgment. At the center was a woman I had never seen before, mid-50s, professionally dressed, with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Her nameplate read, Janice Martinez, Board President. Before beginning, she introduced the 2 men from that night on Millers Creek Road. They wore suits now instead of fake uniforms. And Janice presented them with formal titles: Victor Crane, Director of Community Security Operations, and Derek Simmons, Compliance Enforcement Coordinator. According to her, both held official positions sanctioned by the board under a resolution passed 18 months ago, a resolution that, she noted, gave them broad authority to ensure resident safety and bylaw adherence. It was a masterwork of bureaucratic legitimacy, every abuse wrapped in the language of procedure. A handful of residents sat in folding chairs behind us, watching with the morbid curiosity of people who had seen this before and knew better than to intervene. Janice Martinez conducted the hearing with theatrical precision. She read the charges against Jacqueline in a grave voice: failure to comply with security protocols, verbal threats against enforcement personnel, and creating a hostile environment. She produced witness statements from Crane and Simmons, describing how Jacqueline had been aggressive and uncooperative during a routine safety check. She cited bylaws and amendment dates with practiced fluency. Then she delivered the verdict: a fine of $2,000, mandatory compliance counseling, and a warning that further violations would trigger accelerated removal proceedings. When I tried to object, to point out that those men had ambushed my wife with fake badges and no legal authority, Janice cut me off with a raised hand. Mr. Howard, this community has the right to enforce its own standards. If you don't like it, you're welcome to sell and leave, but while you live here, you will comply. She smiled that cold smile. Or there will be consequences you cannot imagine. On the drive home, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to hire a lawyer, to expose every lie they had told in that room. But Jacqueline was quiet beside me, scrolling through something on her phone. Finally, she spoke. Do you know why I'm not worried about them, Ryan? I shook my head. Because I recognize the architecture, the security division, the compliance fees, the hearings designed to intimidate. It's a textbook extortion framework. I spent years learning how to dismantle exactly this kind of operation. She turned her phone toward me. On the screen was a file dense with notes, photographs, and organizational charts. The title read, Case File Pinewood Heights Racketeering Operation. And my wife looked at me with eyes that held secrets I had never asked about. I didn't tell you everything about my old job, but what I can tell you is this: Janice Martinez thinks she's untouchable. She's wrong, and before this is over, I'm going to prove it. 3 days after the hearing, Jacqueline sat me down at the kitchen table and told me the truth. Not all of it, I would learn later, that some details were classified and would remain so, but enough to make me understand why she had handled everything the way she had. Before we met, she said, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she hadn't touched, I worked for the FBI, Organized Crime Division, specifically financial crimes and racketeering. I spent 7 years building cases against people who used legitimate businesses as fronts for extortion and fraud. She paused, watching my face. I left 5 years ago because I wanted a normal life. I wanted to be your wife, not Special Agent Howard. But when those men pulled me over on Millers Creek Road, I recognized the structure immediately. This isn't an overzealous neighborhood association. This is a criminal enterprise. I sat in silence, processing. 10 years of marriage, and I had never known. She had told me government consulting, frequent travel, and paperwork, all technically true, I suppose, from a certain angle. Why didn't you tell me? I finally asked, surprised to find I wasn't angry, just confused. She looked down at her untouched coffee. Because I wanted to leave that life behind. I wanted you to see me as Jacqueline, not as someone who spent years testifying in federal courtrooms against men who threatened to kill her. She met my eyes. But what's happening in Pinewood Heights, I can't ignore it, not when I know exactly what I'm looking at. Over the next hour, she walked me through everything she had uncovered. Pinewood Heights was a community of 412 homes, large enough to generate significant revenue through mandatory fees, small enough that a tight-knit board could operate without real oversight. The HOA had been collecting security assessments from residents for over 4 years, payments on top of regular dues, justified by the Security Enforcement Division. According to financial documents she had obtained through public records requests, those fees totaled nearly $300,000 annually. But when she cross-referenced the HOA's tax filings with state records, almost 40% of that revenue was unaccounted for. No invoices, no equipment purchases, no explanation for where $120,000 per year had gone. Crane and Simmons are the only personnel, she said, pulling up a spreadsheet. Their official salaries don't come close to explaining the gap. The rest is being funneled through shell companies that trace back to Janice Martinez's family. The property pattern was even more damning. Over the past 3 years, 11 families had sold their homes, a turnover rate triple the county average. 9 had received violation notices before selling. 7 had faced compliance hearings. 4 had liens placed on their properties. And every single home had been purchased by the same real estate company, owned by Martinez's brother-in-law, at prices averaging 15% below market value. They identify targets, manufacture violations, pressure them until they break, then acquire the properties at a discount, Jaxwellen said. It's systematic, and based on what I found in community forums, there have been rumors about the board for years, people whispering about unfair fines, about families who left suddenly, about security officers who seemed more interested in intimidation than safety. No one connected the dots because no one had access to the financial records. I stared at the evidence spread across our kitchen table and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about every family that had been driven out, every resident paying extortion fees they didn't understand, every person too afraid to question why the board operated like a private fiefdom. So, what do? I asked. We have evidence. We could take this to the police, to a lawyer. Jacqueline shook her head. Local police won't touch it. Martinez's cousin is a sergeant in the county sheriff's department. A lawyer would take years, and they have resources to bury us in motions. We need federal jurisdiction. She closed her laptop. 3 days ago, I contacted the FBI field office in the city. I still have connections there, people who trust my judgment. Yesterday, I received confirmation that they're opening an informal review. My heart jumped. That's good, right? They're taking it seriously. She nodded, but her expression remained guarded. It means they're interested, but federal investigations require more than financial discrepancies. They need evidence of ongoing criminal activity, something documented in real time. She paused. Which means I need to give Martinez enough rope to hang herself. I need her to escalate, to make moves that can be observed and recorded. And for that to work, I need you to trust me completely over the next few weeks. No matter what they do, I need you to follow my lead. I thought about Janice Martinez's cold smile, about the families who had lost everything, about the neighbors who had already abandoned us. Then I looked at my wife, this woman I had loved for a decade, without truly knowing, and saw not just the person I had married, but the agent she had been. Yes, I said. I trust you. Jacqueline reached across the table and took my hand. Good. Before she could say more, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and I watched her expression harden. It's already starting, she said quietly, turning the phone toward me. On the screen was an email from the HOA board, sent to every resident in Pinewood Heights. The subject line read, Urgent Security Alert, Resident Threat Assessment. Below it was a photograph of Jacqueline, taken from the hearing, alongside text warning the community about a potentially dangerous individual with a history of federal investigation. The lies had gone public, and the real war was about to begin. The email blast was only the beginning. Within 24 hours, Jacqueline's photograph had been printed and posted on community bulletin boards throughout Pinewood Heights at the mailbox stations, the pool house, the entrance to the walking trails. Each flyer carried the same warning, security notice. This individual has been identified as a potential threat to community safety. Report all sightings to HOA security immediately. They had turned my wife into a wanted poster. I tore down every flyer I could find, but new ones appeared overnight. By the second day, I stopped trying. Someone left a note on our windshield that read simply, "Leave." When I confronted Mr. Patterson, 8 years of borrowed lawnmowers and shared holiday dinners, he wouldn't meet my eyes. "The Chens fought back," he mumbled. "Look what happened to them. Just pay the fines. It's easier." Then he closed his door, and I stood on his porch feeling something break inside me. These were people who had watched our daughter take her first steps. Now they were strangers. The professional attack came 3 days later. Jacqueline worked as a compliance consultant for a financial services firm downtown, a career she had built carefully over 5 years, the foundation of our family's stability. On Thursday, her supervisor called her into a meeting. Someone had sent an anonymous letter to HR claiming Jacqueline had been terminated from federal employment due to psychological instability. The letter included fabricated details, dates, incident reports, a fake disciplinary memo on what appeared to be FBI letterhead. Her supervisor, a decent man named Richardson, said he didn't believe it, but company policy required an investigation. She was placed on administrative leave pending review, without her income. We had maybe 4 months before we couldn't make the mortgage. If she lost the job permanently, no firm in our field would touch her, not with accusations like these following her. I watched her pack her desk photos into a cardboard box and felt the walls closing in. That evening, Jacqueline sat on our back porch staring at the trees beyond our fence, for the first time since this began. I saw exhaustion in her face, the weariness of someone who had spent years building something only to watch it dismantled by strangers. "They're thorough," she said quietly, "more thorough than I expected. Whoever created that fake memo knew FBI documentation well enough to make it look authentic. That's not something a suburban HOA board learns on its own." She turned to me. "Martinez has help, someone with access to templates, procedures, and maybe even personnel records. This is bigger than Pinewood Heights." I wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but that felt like a lie we couldn't afford. Instead, I asked what we did now. She pulled out her phone and showed me an email that had arrived an hour earlier from Janice Martinez. The language was careful, almost lawyerly, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. "Mrs. Howard, it has come to our attention that you have been conducting inquiries into confidential HOA financial matters. While residents are entitled to request certain records through proper channels, we have documented what appear to be attempts to access protected administrative systems. Our legal counsel advises that such activities may constitute violations of both state computer access statutes and federal privacy regulations. Additionally, certain statements attributed to you regarding board members could expose you to significant civil liability. We estimate potential damages, should litigation become necessary, in the range of $200,000. However, the board remains committed to resolving disputes amicably. If your family were to consider relocating, we would be prepared to facilitate a smooth transition and consider all outstanding matters closed. We respectfully request your response by Friday." I read it 3 times. The message was wrapped in reasonable language, but the structure was pure extortion, the same deal offered to the Chens and the others. Leave quietly or be destroyed. For a moment, I understood why so many had taken it. We had evidence of their crimes, but they had the power to ruin us before any investigation concluded. Jacqueline could lose her career permanently. We could lose the house, the place where our daughter had learned to walk, where we had imagined growing old together. I felt something I hadn't felt since basic training, the paralysis of facing an enemy that seemed to hold every advantage. But when I looked at my wife, I saw something shift beneath her exhaustion, a hardness returning, the resolve I had glimpsed in parking garages and on dark roads. "She made mistakes," Jacqueline said softly, sending this from her personal account, naming specific dollar amounts, referencing our attempts to access protected records that state law requires HOAs to provide residents upon a request, and this line about facilitating a smooth transition if we relocate. She shook her head. "That's textbook quid pro quo. She just documented her own extortion scheme." I felt a flicker of hope, but Jacqueline's expression stayed guarded. "Don't misunderstand, she's still dangerous. She has resources, connections in the sheriff's department, and enough money to drag this out for years. The fake FBI memo proves she has access to people who know how to destroy reputations professionally. We're not fighting amateurs. She stood and walked inside, reaching for her laptop. But she also just handed me something I can use. I need to forward this to Gary Morales at the field office tonight. She paused at the door. Friday is their deadline. When we don't respond, they'll escalate again, probably with something public, something designed to force our hand. We need to be ready. Friday came and went without a response from us. The following Monday, a certified letter arrived informing us that an emergency community assembly had been called for Wednesday evening to discuss ongoing security concerns. The subtext was clear. Janice Martinez intended to make an example of us publicly, but Jacqueline had anticipated this. "Remember what I told you about federal investigations?" she said Tuesday night, organizing documents at our kitchen table. "They need to witness ongoing criminal conduct, documented in real time. Martinez is calling a public meeting to announce liens and removal proceedings. That's exactly what Gary's team has been waiting for. She's about to commit new crimes in front of 200 witnesses and federal surveillance." She paused. "There's something else. Derek Simmons reached out to me 3 days ago through an anonymous email. He wants out. He's been documenting Crane and Martinez's orders for months, and he's agreed to cooperate." The community center was packed. When we arrived, over 200 residents filling every seat, with more standing along the walls. We found seats near the back and waited. At the front, Janice Martinez sat behind a long table with Victor Crane on her right and Derek Simmons on her left. Simmons sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on the table, never once looking toward Martinez. I noticed his hands were trembling slightly, whatever courage it had taken for him to reach out to Jacqueline. He was terrified of what would happen next. Martinez, by contrast, radiated confidence. She wore a navy blazer and an expression of practiced authority, the picture of a community leader protecting her neighbors from a threat. Martinez opened with a polished performance. She spoke gravely about maintaining community standards and addressing behaviors that undermine our collective safety. She referenced the security alerts, the compliance violations, the concerning pattern of resistance to legitimate board oversight. She produced documents she claimed demonstrated our history of non-cooperation and mentioned, almost casually, that certain federal employment records had raised questions about Mrs. Howard's stability. The crowd listened attentively. Martinez was careful she never made explicit accusations, only implications. She was building a case through suggestion, letting the audience fill in the damning details themselves. Then she shifted to her conclusion. "The board has made every reasonable effort to resolve this matter through proper channels," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "We have followed every procedure. We have extended every courtesy. Unfortunately, some residents simply refuse to participate in good faith." She glanced at us with performative disappointment. "When individuals demonstrate that they cannot be trusted to uphold community standards, the board has a responsibility to act. Tonight, we will vote on enforcement measures proportional to the severity of the violations measures that I am confident this community will support." It was masterfully vague. She never said lien or removal. She let the threat hang unspoken, maintaining deniability while making her intentions clear to everyone in the room. Jacqueline stood. "Madam President, I'd like to exercise my right to address the board before any vote." Martinez's expression flickered annoyance, quickly suppressed. She hadn't expected us to participate in our own execution, but refusing would undermine the democratic performance she had constructed. "You have 3 minutes, she said. Jacqueline walked to the front carrying her laptop. She connected to the projector without asking permission, and before Martinez could object, the first image appeared: bank transaction records. Not the summary statistics she had shown me at our kitchen table, actual transactions, with account numbers partially redacted, showing transfers from the HOA operating account to 3 corporate entities. "These are wire transfers made over the past 18 months, Jacqueline said. Payments to companies that have never provided any documented services to Pinewood Heights. She clicked to the next slide: corporate registration documents showing those companies traced to addresses linked to Martinez's family members. Residents have never seen these records because they were never included in the annual disclosures required by state law. Martinez stood abruptly. These documents are fabricated. You have no authority to access board financial. But Jacqueline was already advancing. The next slide showed property transfer records, not the pattern she had explained to me, but but something new: email correspondence between Martinez and the real estate company, discussing specific families by name and noting which properties would become available after compliance resolution. These emails were obtained through a federal subpoena issued last week, Jacqueline said. They show direct coordination between the board president and the company acquiring foreclosed properties. The room had gone completely silent. Martinez's face was rigid, her composure cracking at the edges. "This is harassment," Martinez said, her voice rising despite her efforts to control it. "You're a disgruntled resident with a personal vendetta, and I will not allow you to—" She caught herself, visibly struggling to regain her footing. "The board will address these baseless allegations through appropriate legal channels." But the damage was done. She had pivoted from confident authority to defensive denial in the span of 60 seconds, and everyone in the room had witnessed the shift. The back doors opened. 2 men in suits entered, followed by 4 uniformed officers. Gary Morales held up his badge as he walked down the center aisle. "FBI, we need everyone to remain seated." He stopped in front of the board table, his expression professionally neutral. "Janice Martinez, Victor Crane, you're under arrest for wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." He turned to Simmons, who had gone pale. "Mr. Simmons, thank you for your cooperation. We'll need you to come with us to complete your statement." Simmons nodded once, his whole body sagging with what looked like relief. He had been carrying this weight for months, waiting for someone to end it. As officers moved forward with handcuffs, Martinez finally lost control. "You can't do this. I have attorneys. I have connections in this county that you cannot imagine. This community needs me." Morales cut her off calmly. "Ma'am, when you sent threatening communications across state lines and created fraudulent federal documents, you established our jurisdiction. My team has been documenting your activities for 3 weeks." He glanced at Jacqueline. "With assistance from someone who knew exactly what evidence we would need." They led Martinez toward the door. As she passed our row, she turned and fixed Jacqueline with a look of pure venom. "This isn't over." Jacqueline met her gaze steadily. "You're right. The property theft investigation hasn't even started yet. The 48 hours following the arrests transformed our lives in ways I hadn't anticipated." Janice Martinez and Victor Crane were processed at the Federal Detention Center downtown, their bail hearing scheduled for Friday. Derek Simmons spent 14 hours providing testimony that would eventually fill over 200 pages of transcripts. And Jacqueline worked alongside Gary Morales and his team with a focus that left little room for anything else. I found myself in an unfamiliar role, bringing coffee, answering doors when agents arrived with documents, watching from the periphery as the machinery of federal justice ground forward. At one point, standing in our kitchen while Jacqueline walked 3 FBI analysts through financial records spread across our table, I realized I had become a stranger in my own home. Not unwelcome, but peripheral. It was a strange grief, mourning a version of my marriage that had never quite existed while simultaneously feeling pride in the woman my wife had always been. The evidence Derek Simmons provided filled gaps that even Jacqueline's investigation hadn't reached. For 18 months, he had kept meticulous record screenshots of text messages, copies of emails, handwritten notes from meetings where Martinez and Crane discussed which residents to target next. His cooperation hadn't come from a sudden conscience. During his FBI interview, which Jacqueline later described to me, he explained that Martinez had recruited him with promises of steady income, then gradually revealed the operation's true nature once he was too compromised to leave. The anonymous email he had sent to Jacqueline 3 days before the community meeting was the culmination of months of quiet desperation, watching for someone who might actually be capable of ending it. He'd been looking for a way out since the Chen family, Jacqueline told me. He just didn't know who to trust until he saw how I handled the hearing. His cooperation agreement required full disclosure of everything he knew. In exchange, the U.S. Attorney's Office would recommend probation instead of prison time. The financial investigation uncovered crimes beyond what Jacqueline had pieced together from public records. Federal forensic accountants, armed with subpoena power she had never possessed, traced transactions through accounts that had been deliberately obscured. The shell companies she had identified were only the first layer. Beneath them sat a network of fake vendor contracts, inflated maintenance invoices, and consulting fees paid to companies that existed only on paper. The total amount embezzled over 4 years approached $400,000, funding a vacation property in another state, private school tuition for Martinez's grandchildren, and a boat registered to her brother-in-law. But the accountants found this not through Martinez's mistakes, but through systematic reconstruction of every transaction the HOA had processed in 48 months. She was actually careful, one of the analysts admitted to Jacqueline. If you hadn't known what patterns to look for, this could have gone on for another decade. The community's transformation required a catalyst beyond the arrests themselves. That catalyst came Thursday morning, when the FBI released a public statement confirming that Janice Martinez and Victor Crane had been arrested on federal charges, including wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Local news picked up the story by noon, by evening. It was the lead segment on 2 regional broadcasts, complete with footage of Martinez being led from the community center in handcuffs. The HOA's emergency contact system, the same one Martinez had used to distribute warnings about Jacqueline, now carried a message from the county sheriff's office, explaining that an active federal investigation was underway and encouraging residents with relevant information to come forward. The combination of official confirmation and media coverage broke through the denial that had insulated the community. People who had crossed the street to avoid us suddenly stopped to offer awkward apologies. The flyers with Jacqueline's face vanished from the bulletin boards overnight. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Torres took over as lead prosecutor. She was a sharp-featured woman in her early 40s, with a reputation for meticulous preparation, exactly the kind of person you wanted when facing defendants with resources and connections. During our first meeting, which I attended at Jacqueline's insistence, Torres reviewed the evidence with visible satisfaction. "This is clean work," she said. "The financial reconstruction, the witness coordination, the documentation chain better than some of my agents produce." The charges against Martinez ultimately included 12 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of extortion, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of filing false federal documents. Maximum exposure, 37 years. Realistic outcome, 8 to 12. Victor Crane faced similar charges with lighter expected sentencing. So far, he had refused to cooperate, maintaining loyalty that his lawyer was desperately trying to break. The property theft investigation brought forward families I had only known as statistics. The Chens, whose name Mr. Patterson had whispered as a warning, agreed to provide testimony about the 18 months of harassment that had preceded their departure. A retired couple named Morrison described how a single landscaping violation had escalated into weekly inspections, mounting fines, and finally a lien that forced them to sell at 20% below market value. Each story followed the same pattern: manufactured violations, escalating pressure, coercive settlement offers, but hearing them from real people transformed abstract data into human devastation. I sat through 3 of these interviews at Jacqueline's side, and somewhere during the Morrisons' account of watching their home sold to Martinez's brother-in-law, I felt something shift inside me. This had never been just about us. We had stumbled into something that had been destroying families for years, and stopping it had become more important than any personal grievance. The Pattersons reached out directly, inviting us to their home for what turned out to be an uncomfortable confession. 2 years earlier, they had witnessed irregularities at a board meeting, vote counts that didn't match, financial reports that contradicted what they knew about community expenses. Martinez had approached them afterward with a violation notice for an unauthorized fence modification. The notice disappeared when they agreed to stay silent. "We knew something was wrong," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice breaking. "We were just so scared of becoming the next target." It was a sentiment we heard repeatedly as witnesses came forward. Martinez had built her empire on isolation and fear. Now that both were crumbling, the truth emerged in a flood. On Friday, Rachel Torres called with news that shifted everything. Martinez's lawyer had proposed a plea agreement, guilty on reduced charges, 6 to 8 years recommended, in exchange for the government dropping its investigation into her brother-in-law's role in the property scheme. Torres had rejected it immediately. "She doesn't get to protect her family by sacrificing herself halfway," the prosecutor explained. "Either she gives us everyone involved, or she takes her chances at trial." It was a calculated risk. A full trial meant more resources, more time, more opportunities for complications. But Torres was confident, and Jacqueline agreed. Martinez spent years assuming no one would fight back, my wife said after the call. She's about to learn what happens when someone does. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for Monday. Martinez would appear in federal court to hear charges read aloud, enter her plea, and face for the first time the full weight of the system she had spent years manipulating. Jacqueline had been asked to attend as a potential witness. I would be there too, not in any official capacity. But because I refused to let her face this moment alone, we had started together on a dark road with fake police lights in our mirrors. We would finish together in a federal courtroom. But even as we prepared for that public accountability, Jacqueline remained focused on something beyond conviction. Putting Martinez in prison is necessary, she said the night before the hearing. But it's not enough. The system she exploited still exists in communities across this country. If we want this to mean something, really mean something, we have to think about what comes after. The preliminary hearing lasted 47 minutes. Janice Martinez stood before federal judge Helen Whitmore in an orange jumpsuit, her silver hair uncombed, her face stripped of the polished confidence that had dominated every HOA meeting I had ever witnessed. Bail was set at $250,000 in amount that would require liquidating the vacation property and the boat purchased with stolen funds. Victor Crane's hearing followed. When the judge mentioned Derek Simmons's testimony implicating him in the physical intimidation of multiple families, I watched his stubborn defiance crack for the first time. The trial was scheduled for 3 months later. In the interim, the investigation expanded beyond Martinez herself. Her brother-in-law was arrested on conspiracy charges related to the property acquisitions. A former county clerk who had expedited fraudulent lien filings was indicted. Rachel Torres built her case with the methodical patience of someone who understood that convictions are won through preparation, not dramatics interviewing over 40 witnesses, compiling documentary evidence that filled 17 bankers' boxes, reconstructing financial trails that Martinez had spent years burying. The network hadn't collapsed because of carelessness. It collapsed because federal resources and subpoena power finally exposed what careful local investigation never could. Jacqueline consulted regularly, but as the trial approached, I noticed a change in her, a quietness that suggested she was wrestling with something beyond legal strategy. 2 weeks before the trial, I found her on our back porch, the same spot where so many pivotal conversations had unfolded. Rachel asked me to give a victim impact statement at sentencing, she said without preamble. Assuming conviction, I sat beside her. What are you going to say? She was quiet for a long moment. That's what I've been trying to figure out. The trial lasted 8 days. I attended every session, sitting in the gallery behind Jacqueline, watching the systematic dismantling of everything Martinez had built. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, not because Martinez had been sloppy, but because the evidence trail, once accessed through federal authority, told an undeniable story. Financial records, property documents, the emails she had sent, believing they would never surface in a courtroom. Derek Simmons took the stand and described how he had been recruited and gradually compromised until cooperation seemed like the only option. His testimony was devastating, not because it revealed incompetence, but because it illuminated how deliberately the operation had been constructed. The moment that broke something open in me came during the Morrisons' testimony. They were a retired couple in their 70s, soft-spoken and visibly nervous on the witness stand. Mrs. Morrison described the day they had signed the papers selling their home, the home where they had raised 3 children, where they had planned to spend their final years together. We sat in our car in the driveway afterward, she said, her voice trembling, and we just held each other and cried. We didn't know what else to do. I looked at Jacqueline beside me and saw tears on her cheeks. I realized my own face was wet. These weren't statistics or case files. These were people whose lives had been dismantled by someone who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to profit. Sitting in that courtroom, I understood for the first time why Jacqueline had given up a normal life to do this work, and why she might choose to do it again. After 8 days and less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. In that interim, Jacqueline wrote and rewrote her statement dozens of times. Everyone expects me to demand the maximum, she told me one night, surrounded by crumpled drafts. to stand up and catalog all the damage she caused. And part of me wants exactly that. She paused. But that's not why I did this. The courtroom was full residents, journalists, families who had traveled to witness the conclusion. Martinez sat at the defense table, diminished. When Judge Whitmore invited victim statements, Jacqueline walked to the podium carrying no notes. The room went silent. "Your Honor," she began, "I'm not here to ask for vengeance. I'd be lying if I said that desire hasn't crossed my mind. But that's not why this case matters." She paused, her gaze steady. 11 families lost their homes. Dozens more paid fines they couldn't afford because fighting seemed impossible. They believed no one would ever hold the board accountable, and for years, they were right. Her voice remained level, but I heard the weight beneath it. What happened in Pinewood Heights will happen again, in other communities, unless this sentencing sends a clear message, not to Ms. Martinez specifically, but to everyone who believes they can weaponize community governance for personal profit. She stepped back from the podium. "I'm asking for consequences that make the next person think twice. That's all." Judge Whitmore sentenced Janice Martinez to 11 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 8. Victor Crane received 7 years. The brother-in-law received 4. As bailiffs led Martinez past our row, she met my eyes for a moment. I expected hatred or defiance. Instead, I saw something unexpected: recognition. She understood what she had lost and why. Then she was gone. That evening, driving home through streets that somehow felt lighter, Jacqueline received a call from Rachel Torres. "The Bureau was impressed with your work," the prosecutor said. "Gary Morales asked me to pass along a message." Jacqueline glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "He wants to know if you've ever considered coming back." Jacqueline didn't answer Gary Morales' question that night. For 2 weeks. The offer hung between us, unspoken but present in the silences of our conversations. I didn't push. After everything we had been through, I understood that this decision was hers alone. She had spent 5 years building a life outside the Bureau, and in a matter of months, she had been pulled back into exactly the kind of work she had walked away from. The question wasn't whether she was capable. The question was whether she wanted to be that person again. She told me on a Sunday evening in late August, sitting at our kitchen table after dinner. No preamble, no build-up, just Jacqueline being direct, the way she always was when something mattered. "I'm not going back to the Bureau," she said, "but I'm not going back to compliance consulting either." She met my eyes. "I want to help people like the Morrisons. Families dealing with HOA abuse who don't know their rights or how to fight back. Most can't afford lawyers. Most don't know where to start." She paused. "I want to build something that gives them tools before things get as bad as they got here." I took her hand across the table. "That sounds like something worth doing." The organization she eventually built was called the Homeowner Rights Initiative. It started small, a website with educational resources, a hotline staffed by volunteers with legal training, a network of attorneys willing to take pro bono cases. Within a year, it had helped over 300 families navigate disputes with their associations. Within 2 years, it had contributed to legislative reforms in 4 states. Jacqueline testified before committees and consulted with oversight agencies, channeling everything she had learned into something that felt hers, genuinely not the Bureau's, not anyone else's. The community's recovery was messier than I had hoped. The special election to replace Martinez's board drew more candidates than expected, and the campaign revealed divisions that had been buried under years of enforced silence. Some residents wanted aggressive reform, others worried about property values and preferred a quieter transition. A handful still believed Martinez had been treated unfairly, convinced that the federal charges were exaggerated or politically motivated. The new board, which included 2 former victims of the old regime, faced criticism from multiple directions in its first months. They hired an independent auditor, dissolved the Security Enforcement Division, and established a resident ombudsman position. Each decision sparked debate. The auditor's initial report revealed additional financial irregularities that the previous investigation had missed, leading to a tense community meeting where accusations flew and tempers frayed. It wasn't the clean resolution I had imagined, but it was real, and it was progress. The Pattersons invited us to their 4th of July barbecue, an invitation that carried weight neither of us acknowledged aloud. We went. Some neighbors sought us out with questions about the case. Others kept their distance, still uncertain how to feel about everything that had happened. Mrs. Chen, who had returned briefly for the trial, sent Jacqueline a handwritten letter thanking her for what she had done. Mr. Thomas apologized for believing Martinez's lies about us, though his wife remained cool and formal whenever we crossed paths. Healing, I learned, doesn't happen uniformly. Some wounds close quickly, others take years. A few never fully heal at all. About 18 months after Martinez's sentencing, I was driving home from work when a car behind me flashed its lights. For a split second, my stomach clenched the memory of blue and red on a dark road, of men claiming authority they didn't have. Then the car passed, just a teenager with his high beams, and the moment dissolved. But sitting in my driveway afterward, I thought about how different things had become. The road that had once felt threatening was just a road now. The woman I had married, whose depths I had never fully understood, had become someone I knew more clearly than ever, not because she had changed, but because I had finally learned to see her. That night, I found Jacqueline in her home office reviewing case files for a family in another state. She looked up when I entered, and I saw the same focused intensity I had seen on so many nights, the determination, the refusal to let things go unanswered. But there was something else now, a settledness that hadn't been there before. "Do you remember what you said to those men on Miller's Creek Road?" I asked. "The night they pulled you over." She smiled slightly. "I said a lot of things. You told them they picked the wrong target." I leaned against the doorframe. "I don't think even you knew how right you were." She glanced around the office at the files, the advocacy materials, the framed letters from families she had helped. I didn't know it would lead to this. Neither had I. But standing there in the quiet of our home, watching her work, I understood something that had taken me 18 months to fully grasp. What made Jacqueline dangerous to people like Martinez wasn't her training or her credentials. It was simpler than that. She saw clearly, she documented carefully, and she refused to look away. In a world built on the assumption that most people will choose silence over conflict, that single quality was enough to bring down an empire. Outside, the summer evening was fading into darkness. Somewhere in the neighborhood, kids were laughing. A dog barked. Normal sounds of a normal community, one that had nearly been hollowed out by corruption, and was slowly, imperfectly, finding its way back. Jacqueline returned to her files. I went to make coffee. And life, as it tends to do, continued.